James Carter woke up to the usual sounds of his suburban neighborhood, the soft chirping of birds mingling with the hum of the distant highway. It was a normal Thursday morning, the kind that had come to define his routine. A 38-year-old community outreach coordinator, James had spent the last decade working tirelessly to improve the lives of those around him, especially in the underprivileged parts of the town. His days were filled with meetings, discussions, and working with local leaders to bridge gaps between law enforcement and the communities they served. People knew him as a thoughtful, patient, and passionate individual who was always willing to help. This Thursday, like so many before, James woke up early to catch a cup of coffee before heading into his office. He looked out the kitchen window at his quiet street. The sun was still low, casting a soft golden hue across the row of houses. Everything seemed calm. Nothing out of the ordinary. After a quick breakfast of eggs and toast, James grabbed his jacket and briefcase, prepared for the meetings ahead. His calendar was packed with appointments, local council members, school leaders, and some community activists who had reached out to him for support. There was a specific meeting with the local police department he had been looking forward to, one that he hoped would bring meaningful change to a recent uptick in tensions between the police force and the citizens. He believed that true reform could only be achieved by open conversations, and he prided himself on being a bridge builder. With his mind set on the day's tasks, James left his house, locked the door behind him, and made his way to the car. The commute was short, just a 15-minute drive to the heart of the town. As he navigated the familiar streets, he noticed a few minor things out of place: construction equipment blocking one of the main roads and an unmarked police car parked by a corner store. It wasn't unusual for this part of town, but it caught his attention just the same. It was still early enough that the streets weren't crowded with commuters yet, and the roads felt unusually quiet. Turning left onto a small side street, James drove past the local diner, his favorite spot for lunch, when a sudden jarring sound broke his peaceful morning. He looked in his rearview mirror and saw the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser behind him. Confused, James immediately pulled over to the side of the road. It wasn't the first time he had been stopped by a police officer. Being a black man in a predominantly white town had its challenges, but James had always tried to approach these situations with calmness and respect, hoping to defuse any potential issues. He sat in the car, hands on the steering wheel, waiting for the officer to approach. A moment later, a tall, imposing figure appeared at his window. The officer was wearing a black uniform with a name tag that read Reynolds. His partner, a slightly shorter officer, stood by the rear of the car. The way they approached was abrupt, without the usual pleasantries. "License and registration," Officer Reynolds demanded in a no-nonsense tone, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. James complied, reaching into the glove compartment for his documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "We'll get to that," Reynolds snapped, interrupting him. He didn't offer any explanation as he stepped back to his patrol car to run the paperwork. James shifted in his seat, uneasy but trying to stay composed. He didn't know what was happening. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a red light, and his car was in perfect condition. He could feel the tension in the air, a weight that didn't feel right. The officers were acting like he was a criminal, despite the fact that he had done nothing wrong. Minutes passed, and as the silence stretched between them, James began to feel an unease creeping up his spine. The officers seemed to be taking longer than usual. His mind started racing. Was this about the meeting with the police department he had scheduled for later that day? He'd been vocal about the need for reform, and maybe this was some kind of response to his advocacy. He couldn't help but wonder if his work had made him a target in a town that wasn't always open to change. The second officer, Officer Martin, approached the window again, this time with a much sterner expression. "Step out of the vehicle, please," he ordered. "Excuse me?" James replied, his voice tinged with confusion. "Why do I need to get out of the car? I haven't done anything wrong." "We'll talk outside," Officer Martin insisted, his tone now more commanding. James hesitated, but he didn't want to escalate the situation. He opened the car door slowly and stepped out onto the curb. His mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. What had started as a routine stop was now taking an uncomfortable turn. He stood there, facing the officers, wondering if there was some mistake. Officer Reynolds came forward, his voice low but firm. "You're not cooperating, and we don't like that. You're being difficult." He reached out to grab James's arm. "I'm not being difficult. I've done nothing wrong." James protested, pulling his arm back instinctively. "Why are you treating me like this?" The officers exchanged a glance, and that was when the situation started to spiral. "We're done talking," Officer Martin snapped, his voice rising. In one swift motion, he shoved James into the side of the car, pinning him down. The sharp pain of the impact against the cold metal made James gasp. "Get off me! What are you doing?" James yelled, but it was too late. The officers, now fully agitated, began to wrestle him to the ground. James's mind was spinning. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. He had been stopped by police before, but never like this, never with such aggression. He struggled, trying to break free, but the two officers were too strong. The situation escalated rapidly as the officers shouted at James to stop resisting. But James wasn't resisting, they were the ones being aggressive. His heart pounded in his chest as they twisted his arms behind his back, slamming his face against the pavement. He could feel the rough ground scraping against his cheek, the pressure building in his shoulder. In that moment, it wasn't just the physical pain that hit him. It was the realization that, in that very moment, he was seen as a threat solely because of the color of his skin. Then, just as the officers began tightening their grip on him, something changed. A black SUV screeched to a halt next to the scene. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his presence commanding the attention of everyone nearby. It was Agent Michael Johnson, a Secret Service agent who James had known for years. The moment he stepped onto the scene, the officers froze, their hands still on James. "Back off, now!" Agent Johnson ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. The officers hesitated, looking to each other for a moment before stepping away, confused and reluctant. James, still dazed, looked up in disbelief. The agent didn't say another word, but the power of his presence was undeniable. It was only then that the officers began to realize who they had just attacked. "Do you know who this is?" Agent Johnson asked, his gaze locked on the officers. "This man is James Carter, a former security consultant for the President of the United States. You've just assaulted a man with high-level government connections." The officers stood in stunned silence, finally realizing the gravity of their actions. The crowd that had gathered, many of them filming on their phones, watched in utter shock. James, though bruised and battered, managed to rise to his feet with Agent Johnson's help, but his mind was already racing. The situation had shifted in an instant, and the consequences were unimaginable. It was then that James realized this wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about a random case of police brutality. This was the beginning of something bigger, something that would change not only his life but the lives of everyone in the community. The officers stood there, their faces red with shame, while the wheels of a much larger machine, one they couldn't comprehend, began to turn. The incident was like a thunderclap, reverberating through the community. For days, the scene played over and over in James Carter's mind, the pain of that moment still fresh in his body and soul. His back ached from the rough handling, and his hands were bruised from the restraints, but it was the humiliation that lingered the longest. To be treated as though he were some kind of criminal, someone who was disposable simply because of the color of his skin, it was an experience he'd endured countless times before, but this time, the consequences were far greater. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings with lawyers, and conversations with the police department. James had been placed on administrative leave from his community outreach position, and the media was having a field day with the story. Headlines screamed about a black man beaten by police and officers unaware of his identity, but the details were muddled and sensationalized. The facts were twisted, with some outlets painting James as a victim of systemic racism and others questioning his actions, blaming him for the altercation. To the outside world, James was just another headline. But to those who knew him, he was a man who had spent his life fighting for justice. James sat in his living room, looking at the TV as another news anchor recounted the events of that day. His stomach churned, but it wasn't just the discomfort from the bruises on his body, it was the realization that his story was being told by people who had no idea who he truly was or what he had worked for. It felt as though the very essence of his character was being erased. He wasn't just the man who had been violently attacked, he was also a dedicated community leader, a man who had worked tirelessly to foster understanding between the police and the people they served. But now, he was just another face in the crowd of victims. He couldn't help but think of the faces of those officers, the coldness in their eyes, the way they had approached him like a threat. The fear and anger in their voices when they shouted at him, when they slammed him into the car. That was what he remembered most, their sheer disregard for his humanity. But even more shocking than their aggression was the complete lack of awareness of who he was. It wasn't until Agent Johnson intervened that they realized they had just brutalized someone with ties to the highest echelons of power. James didn't know whether to be angry or terrified that it took such a connection for them to stop. As the days passed, James found himself grappling with a mounting sense of responsibility. He had always known that the system was flawed, but now it felt like a deep, personal betrayal. The outpouring of support from the community was overwhelming. People who had worked with him, lived alongside him, or heard about his efforts to bridge the divide. Between law enforcement and marginalized groups sent messages, made phone calls, and organized rallies in his name. But James wasn't sure what to make of it all. It wasn't the kind of attention he had sought. What he had been through, what so many others like him had gone through, wasn't a story that should have to be told in the first place. This wasn't about him being famous or connected, this was about the deep, systemic issues that were impacting people every day, often without recognition. That's when things began to take an unexpected turn. James had been told by his attorney that the city had offered him a settlement, a large sum of money in exchange for him dropping any legal action against the officers involved. It was tempting. It would be a way to move on, to get his life back on track. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that taking the settlement would be the easy way out. It would allow the system to continue operating as it always had, without accountability or change. That night, as James sat in his kitchen, he received a call that would change the course of everything. The voice on the other end was familiar, but he hadn't heard it in years. It was President Samantha Clark, the first female and first black president of the United States. She had been a mentor to James, and their relationship went back to when she was still a senator. James had worked with her on a number of initiatives aimed at reforming the criminal justice system, and they had shared a mutual respect for each other. But hearing her voice now, so unexpectedly, sent a chill through him. "James," she said, her tone urgent yet calm, "I saw the video. I know what happened. And I know you're hurting, but I need you to hear me out." He didn't know what to expect, but the way she spoke left little room for doubt. She had always been a woman of action, someone who didn't waste time on pleasantries. She was focused, direct, and powerful. "I'm putting together a task force," President Clark continued. "A team to investigate the incident, but also to address the broader issues within law enforcement. We can't allow what happened to you to become just another statistic, James. This is bigger than us. It's about creating real, lasting change." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. James had worked with the president before, but this was different. She wasn't just a politician, she was someone who had the power to make a tangible difference. And yet, James couldn't shake the feeling that by involving himself in this fight, he would be stepping into a world far bigger than he had ever imagined. "What do you need from me?" James asked, his voice steady but uncertain. "I need you to come to Washington," President Clark replied. "I need you to help lead this initiative. Your voice, your experience, matters more than ever." The weight of her request hit James like a ton of bricks. He had always been the person who tried to stay out of the spotlight, the one who worked behind the scenes to help others. But this was different. The stakes were higher, the world was watching, and the fight was no longer just about him, it was about everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated by the system. The next morning, as James prepared to board a flight to Washington, he felt a mixture of fear, anger, and uncertainty. His heart ached for the people he had worked with over the years, the families he had helped, and the countless individuals who would never have the opportunity to sit in the room with powerful figures like President Clark. He had fought for change his whole life, but now he was being thrust into a battle that would require him to confront not only his own fears but the fears of an entire nation. The flight to Washington was uneventful, but the weight of the situation hung over him like a storm cloud. What would it mean to be in the heart of the political machine? How would he navigate the complex web of alliances, power struggles, and public scrutiny? And most importantly, would his efforts actually lead to meaningful change, or would they be swallowed by the very system he had spent his life trying to reform? Upon arriving in Washington, James was escorted to the White House, where he would meet with President Clark and her inner circle. The building was massive, its marble walls echoing with history, but as James walked through its halls, he couldn't help but feel the burden of the moment. This wasn't a dream, it was a call to action. The first meeting was held in a small, private conference room. President Clark greeted him with a firm handshake, her face showing concern but also determination. She wasted no time getting to the point. "James, I know this isn't easy, but we're in a critical moment," she began. "The system is broken, and we need people like you to help lead this charge. It's going to be hard, and there will be resistance. But if we're going to fix things, we have to start here." James nodded, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on his shoulders. He had always believed in the cause, but now, it felt as though the entire world was watching. And with that weight came a new responsibility, one that he couldn't escape, no matter how much he wanted to. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firm. "Let's make this count." And as he sat at the table, surrounded by the most powerful people in the country, he knew that this moment was not just about him. It was about everyone who had been affected by the injustice he had suffered. It was about the countless others who had lived in fear, never knowing if they would make it home alive after a routine traffic stop. And most importantly, it was about the future that he and President Clark were determined to create, where justice would no longer be something that only a few had access to. This was just the beginning. The next few weeks unfolded like a whirlwind. Washington, D.C. had become both a battleground and a beacon of hope, and James found himself at the center of it all. As he settled into his new role, he quickly realized that what had started as an unexpected phone call had transformed into a mission far more complex and challenging than he ever imagined. The task force was officially in place, and the nation was watching. The media had continued to cover the events of that day, the brutal altercation, the shocking revelation that James was a close confidant of the president, and the subsequent fallout. It was no longer just about the violence James had suffered. It was about systemic change, about addressing the fractures that had existed for decades. And it was about facing the uncomfortable truth that no one, not even those in power, could afford to ignore any longer. As part of the task force, James found himself working alongside a diverse group of experts, activists, and political leaders. The room was filled with people who, like him, had witnessed firsthand the destructive consequences of systemic inequality. But despite the shared commitment to justice, the tension was palpable. Washington was a place of compromise, negotiation, and often, power struggles. Some members of the task force seemed more focused on maintaining the status quo than on making real change, while others were relentless in their pursuit of justice, unwilling to settle for anything less than reform. It didn't take long for James to feel the weight of this divide. His previous experience as a community organizer had prepared him for many things, but the intricacies of high-level politics were a different beast altogether. The political game in Washington was one of alliances, favors, and deals that sometimes left the needs of the people behind. As he sat at the table during meetings, he often felt like an outsider, a man who had seen the worst of what the system could do, trying to make sense of a world where power was often prioritized over people. But as frustrating as the process was, there were moments when James felt the flicker of hope. One such moment occurred during a closed-door meeting with President Clark. The task force had been discussing a potential bill that would provide funding for police reform and community outreach programs, but the details were still being hashed out. The room was divided, with some pushing for incremental changes, while others, like James, were advocating for sweeping reforms that would address the root causes of police violence and racial inequality. The debate was heated, and at times, it seemed like they would never reach a consensus. It was in this moment of frustration that President Clark spoke up, her voice calm but commanding. "We're not here to make compromises," she said, looking directly at the group. "We're here to make change. We need to ask ourselves a simple question: what kind of country do we want to live in? If we want a country where everyone is treated equally, where the police serve and protect all people, not just some, then we can't afford to be timid. We have to be bold. We have to be unwavering in our commitment to justice. And that starts now." Her words were like a spark in the room. James could see the shift in energy. He knew that President Clark's leadership was the key to pushing this movement forward. Her unwavering commitment to justice gave him the strength he needed to continue fighting, even when it felt like everything around him was working against him. But the road ahead was anything but smooth. As the task force worked tirelessly to draft the bill, they faced constant pushback from powerful interest groups. Law enforcement unions, wealthy donors with vested interests in maintaining the status quo, and even some members of Congress who feared the political fallout of such bold reforms were all doing everything they could to derail the process. Behind closed doors, James could hear the whispers of doubt and hesitation. The stakes were high, and the pressure to compromise was mounting. Despite these obstacles, James refused to back down. He had witnessed the violence and injustice firsthand, and he knew that if he didn't fight for change now, the cycle would continue. He began to push harder, reaching out to grassroots organizations, mobilizing communities, and organizing rallies in support of the bill. The public response was overwhelming. Thousands of people turned out for the protests, demanding accountability from law enforcement and urging their representatives to support the reforms. For the first time in a long time, it felt as though the people had the power to make a real difference. But even as the momentum grew, the task force was plagued by internal divisions. Some members were more focused on appeasing their political donors than on crafting a bill that would truly address the needs of the people. And behind the scenes, powerful figures were working tirelessly to discredit James and his efforts. They painted him as an extremist, as someone who was trying to tear down the system rather than work within it. The media ran stories questioning his motives, digging into his past, and attempting to undermine his credibility. But James was undeterred. He knew that the fight was bigger than any personal attack or political obstacle. As the weeks turned into months, James began to realize that this fight wasn't just about a single piece of legislation. It was about changing the very fabric of the country, a country where justice had long been out of reach for people like him. It was about challenging the structures that perpetuated inequality, that allowed racism to thrive, and that gave police unchecked power over communities of color. The task force wasn't just writing a bill, they were writing a new chapter in American history, one where justice and equality weren't just ideals, but realities. The pressure continued to mount as the deadline for passing the bill approached. The political environment was growing more hostile, and the media was fueling the fire with sensationalized stories about the task force's work. But James remained resolute. He knew that this fight would require every ounce of strength he had, and then some. One fateful evening, as the task force was finalizing the language of the bill, a devastating blow came. An anonymous source leaked a document to the press that revealed a significant loophole in the bill, one that would allow police departments to continue using some of the most aggressive and harmful tactics that had been the catalyst for the violence James had experienced. The leak sent shockwaves through the political world. Critics pounced, claiming that the bill was nothing more than window dressing, an attempt to placate the public without truly addressing the systemic issues that needed to be fixed. The leak threatened to undo everything the task force had worked for. It was a devastating setback, one that made James question whether any progress had been made at all. But in that moment of crisis, President Clark showed why she was the leader they needed. She called an emergency meeting, gathering the task force to discuss their next steps. The pressure was overwhelming, but President Clark's unwavering resolve kept them focused. "We've come too far to let this derail us," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "This bill is our chance to make real change, and we're not going to let a mistake stop us. We'll fix this, and we'll fix it together." In that moment, James knew they couldn't afford to give up. They couldn't allow this setback to define their efforts. They had to push forward, no matter the cost. The fight for justice wasn't easy, and it wasn't supposed to be. But James was determined to see it through. The task force worked tirelessly, revising the bill and addressing the concerns that had been raised. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a step toward the kind of justice James had always dreamed of. As the bill finally passed through Congress, James found himself standing on the steps of the Capitol, surrounded by supporters, activists, and lawmakers who had fought alongside him. The victory was bittersweet. It was a win, yes, but it was only the beginning. James knew that the fight for justice would continue, that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope, a hope that one day, the world would be different. A world where justice was no longer just a dream, but a reality for everyone. And as he looked out at the crowd, he knew that the work was far from over. The fight had just begun. As the dust began to settle after the monumental passage of the reform bill, James felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The weeks of pressure, uncertainty, and betrayal had taken their toll, but he had made it through. The bill was a historic step forward in the fight for justice, but James knew it was only a single chapter in a much longer book. The real work was just beginning. He had been thrust into a position of leadership, one that required more than just a passion for change. It required a deep understanding of the systems he was fighting against, the patience to navigate politics, and the ability to inspire a movement that could carry the momentum forward. And as the nation celebrated the success of the bill, James couldn't shake the feeling that something even larger was coming, a reckoning that would demand all the courage and conviction he had left. The fallout from the bill's passage was immediate and intense. On one hand, activists and grassroots organizations hailed it as a victory. Communities of color, who had long felt abandoned and oppressed by the system, saw the bill as a glimmer of hope that things could finally change. The media, too, shifted its narrative, with coverage focusing on the powerful movements that had mobilized behind the bill and the long-standing struggles that had led to this moment. But on the other hand, the pushback from law enforcement unions and conservative politicians was swift and fierce. They argued that the reforms were too radical, that they undermined the authority of police officers, and that the bill was an affront to the very foundations of law and order. In the face of this opposition, James knew he had to hold his ground. He had seen too much, the lives lost, the communities destroyed, the pain of those who had suffered at the hands of the very people who were supposed to protect them. And he wasn't about to let that fight go in vain. Yet, despite the victory, James found himself growing increasingly isolated. The public still demanded change, but the realities of implementing those changes were far more complicated. The bill was a step in the right direction, but it was just a start. The police were still resisting, still fighting tooth and nail to maintain their power. And even with the new legislation in place, James saw that the entrenched systems of inequality were far from dismantled. The bill had brought about some reform, but it wasn't the sweeping change he had hoped for. The political landscape was fractured, with different factions each pushing their own version of what justice should look like. The compromise and negotiation that were necessary to pass the bill had left a bitter taste in his mouth. What had been billed as a comprehensive plan to address police brutality and systemic racism had become watered down, full of loopholes and exceptions that allowed the status quo to remain intact. The task force had pushed hard for meaningful change, but in the end, their idealism had been tempered by the political realities of Washington. In the months that followed, James found himself faced with the difficult reality of how little the bill had actually achieved. The police departments that were supposed to be held accountable continued their brutal practices, often using the ambiguity in the law to justify their actions. Communities that had once hoped for change began to lose faith, feeling betrayed by a system that promised reform but delivered only token gestures. The backlash from law enforcement was strong, and many officers took to the streets in protest, claiming that they were being unfairly targeted and vilified. James watched as these protests played out on the news, the images of police in full riot gear clashing with activists on one side and officers in the other. It was a stark reminder that the battle for justice was far from over, that even the passage of a historic bill couldn't change the hearts and minds of those who held power in the system. And then came the second unexpected twist. It began with a series of leaked memos, a revelation that certain members of the task force had been in discussions with corporate donors who had deep ties to law enforcement interests. The public's trust in the reform effort was shattered. James was blindsided. He had known that the system was riddled with corruption, but to learn that some of the very people he had trusted to fight for justice were involved in deals with the very groups who had been complicit in the oppression was a crushing blow. The backlash was swift. Protests erupted again, this time not just demanding justice for the victims of police brutality, but for the betrayal of those who had promised change and failed to deliver. It seemed like no one could be trusted, not even those who had fought alongside him for so long. James felt as though he was caught in the middle of a storm, surrounded by the people who had once supported him, now turning on him, demanding answers, and calling for accountability. The media, ever hungry for scandal, pounced on the story, painting James as yet another cog in the corrupt system. But James knew better. He knew that if he didn't step up now, the entire movement would crumble. He couldn't let this betrayal define everything they had fought for. He made the decision to confront the issue head-on. In a televised address, James called out the members of the task force who had sold out to corporate interests. He refused to back down, even in the face of overwhelming pressure. He knew that to move forward, he had to be honest, not just with the public, but with himself. He spoke about the compromises that had been made, the forces at work behind the scenes, and the personal disappointments he had faced. He acknowledged that the bill had not been everything they had hoped for, but he also reminded the public that the fight for justice was far from over. The reforms they had passed were a step in the right direction, but they were just one piece of the puzzle. And James wasn't about to stop fighting. His words struck a chord with the public. Many who had once doubted him now saw him as a man of principle, willing to take on the corrupt system, no matter the cost. The leaks and the betrayals didn't define James. His integrity did. As the months went by, he continued to push for further reforms, working with activists, lawyers, and community leaders to craft new legislation that would close the loopholes in the current bill. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had learned something important during this battle. The only way to create lasting change was to be relentless, to push through the obstacles, and to fight for what was right, no matter how hard it was. But the challenge didn't end there. As James worked to build support for new reforms, he found himself facing even greater resistance from the forces that had once seemed invincible. Corporate interests, law enforcement unions, and even political figures who had once supported him began to circle the wagons, working together to undermine his efforts. It was a sobering reminder of the power and reach of those who benefited from the status quo. They were willing to do whatever it took to preserve their influence. In the midst of this, James found an unexpected ally. The president, who had once been the face of the reform movement, had become disillusioned by the process. She had seen firsthand how difficult it was to enact real change in a system that was so deeply entrenched in power and privilege. But rather than giving up, she chose to stand beside James and continue the fight. Together, they formed a new coalition of activists, lawmakers, and everyday citizens who were committed to holding the system accountable, no matter the cost. It was a fight that would require more than just legislative changes. It would require a shift in the culture, a fundamental change in the way people viewed justice, power, and equality. James knew that he couldn't do it alone. The weight of the fight was too much for one person to bear. But with the support of his allies, and the unwavering determination to create a system where justice was truly blind, James began to believe that they could, in time, achieve the change they had fought for. The road ahead would be long, and the opposition would be fierce, but James was ready. This was his fight, his calling. And he would never stop, no matter how impossible the journey seemed. James's resolve hardened as he sat in the quiet of his office, staring at the sea of documents scattered across his desk. The room was dim, with only the soft glow of his desk lamp cutting through the darkness. He had been at this for hours, his mind spinning with the weight of what was happening around him. The task force, the leaked memos, the betrayals, it all felt like a tangled web of chaos and confusion. And yet, through it all, he could still see the glimmer of hope that had brought him to this point. It was a hope rooted in the belief that change was possible, no matter how hard the road ahead seemed. The work wasn't done. Not by a long shot. He had been thrust into the national spotlight, forced to navigate a landscape of complex political maneuvering, powerful enemies, and disillusioned allies. It wasn't the fight he had imagined when he first started, but it was the fight he had been called to. The reforms they had passed, while groundbreaking in many ways, had only scratched the surface. James knew that to truly dismantle the systemic racism that had plagued the justice system for generations, they needed more than just new laws. They needed a cultural shift, a transformation of how the country viewed justice, fairness, and equality. And that transformation wouldn't come easily. The opposition had only grown stronger in the wake of the bill's passage. Police unions, politicians, and corporate lobbyists had dug in their heels, determined to preserve the status quo. James had seen it firsthand, the way the powerful protected their own interests, using every tool at their disposal to maintain control. The resistance was relentless, and every victory seemed to be met with a new wave of opposition. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. But James had learned something important in this battle. The fight for justice was never easy, and it was never quick. It took persistence, and it took courage. And above all, it required a belief that change was possible, even when it felt like the odds were stacked against you. One of the most difficult challenges James faced in the aftermath of the bill's passage was the growing divide between the reform movement and the very communities they were trying to help. The backlash from law enforcement had been fierce, but it was the disillusionment from the communities most affected by police brutality that weighed on him the most. For many, the bill had felt like a betrayal, a false promise that had failed to deliver the sweeping change they had hoped for. The law had been watered down, the provisions compromised, and the loopholes were all too apparent. People had trusted James and the others on the task force to deliver real change, and now, they felt abandoned. It was a crushing blow to his spirit, one that left him questioning whether they had truly done enough. But even in the face of this, James knew that he couldn't stop. He couldn't let this moment of failure define everything they had worked for. There was still too much at stake. The battle wasn't over, it had only just begun. The task force had laid the groundwork, but it would take years, decades, perhaps, for the full impact of the reforms to be felt. And in the meantime, the struggle for justice would continue. James had become a symbol of that struggle, for better or for worse. The pressure was immense, but he refused to back down. He had come too far to let this fight slip away. James reached out to his allies, activists, community leaders, even some of the more progressive politicians who had stood by him through the tough times. They knew that the work wasn't finished. Together, they began crafting new strategies to push for more comprehensive reforms. It wouldn't be easy. The political climate was hostile, and the opposition was more entrenched than ever. But there was something different this time. The failures of the past had only served to strengthen their resolve. They would not be deterred by the setbacks. They would continue the fight. Meanwhile, the media continued to cover the fallout from the bill's passage. It wasn't all bad. Some outlets focused on the small victories, the communities where the reforms were actually making a difference, the activists who had successfully pushed for greater accountability. But the majority of the coverage was negative. The media was quick to seize on the division within the movement, highlighting the growing frustration and anger from the very people they had promised to help. James found himself on the receiving end of harsh criticism from all sides. Those who had once hailed him as a hero now questioned his integrity, wondering how someone who had been so committed to the cause could have allowed the bill to fall so short of its potential. At times, it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. The media, the activists, the politicians, the communities, it all felt like an overwhelming storm that he couldn't outrun. But even as the criticism piled up, James found solace in the quiet moments of reflection. He thought about the lives that had been lost, the families that had been destroyed by police brutality, the communities that had been torn apart by injustice. He thought about the people who had fought beside him, who had put their trust in him, and he knew that he couldn't let them down. He had to keep fighting, even if it seemed like the world was against him. And so, he did. James redoubled his efforts, pushing harder than ever to get the reforms he believed in passed. He worked tirelessly, meeting with lawmakers, speaking at rallies, and using his platform to shine a light on the injustices that still existed in the system. Slowly but surely, his message began to resonate again. People began to see that the fight for justice wasn't just about passing a single bill, it was about creating a movement, one that would continue to push for change, no matter how long it took. In the midst of this, James found an unexpected ally. The president, who had been largely silent in the months following the bill's passage, reached out to him. She had watched as the movement faltered, as the promises of reform were undermined by the very forces that had opposed it from the beginning. But she also knew that James was the key to moving forward. She asked him to join her in a new push for reform, one that would build on the foundation they had laid but go even further, addressing the gaps that had been left in the wake of the previous bill. Together, they would challenge the status quo and fight for a justice system that truly served all people, not just the powerful. James agreed, and the two of them became an unstoppable force. With the president by his side, James was able to galvanize the movement once again. The push for justice was no longer just a battle in Washington, it was a nationwide movement, one that united activists, lawmakers, and citizens in a common cause. They knew that the road ahead would be long, but with their combined efforts, they were determined to keep pushing forward. The next chapter of the fight for justice had begun, and James was ready to lead the charge. As the days passed, James found himself at the center of a whirlwind. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of hope and uncertainty. The president's push for new, more comprehensive reforms had stirred both excitement and anxiety across the nation. The public had been waiting for something to change, and now, at last, they were seeing signs of real progress. But with the promise of reform came the inevitable backlash. Those who had fought so hard to maintain the status quo were not about to let go without a fight. Powerful political forces began to regroup, strategizing ways to undermine the new efforts before they could gain any momentum. It was a battle on all fronts, political, social, and emotional. James had prepared himself for this. After all, this was the cost of progress. He had witnessed firsthand the ways in which systems of power fought tooth and nail to preserve their dominance. But the stakes were higher now. With the weight of the nation's hopes resting on their shoulders, James and the president couldn't afford to falter. The pressure was mounting, and there were moments when James wondered if he could hold up under the strain. He had been at this for so long, and the constant barrage of criticism and opposition threatened to break him. But every time he felt like giving up, he thought about the faces of the families he had met along the way, the mothers and fathers who had lost their children, the communities torn apart by injustice, and he knew he couldn't stop. Not now, not when there was still so much work to do. The first big test of their new initiative came when a prominent police union, one of the most powerful in the country, launched a full-scale campaign to discredit the reforms. They flooded the media with ads, interviews, and social media posts, painting the new laws as a threat to public safety. They accused the president and James of being out of touch with the realities of policing, of pandering to activist groups without understanding the challenges officers faced on the ground. The messaging was strategic, designed to tap into the fears of everyday citizens, particularly in areas where crime was a persistent issue. The fearmongering was effective. Public opinion began to shift, and the president found herself losing support in key battleground states. James could feel the tension building as the media backlash grew louder. He had become the face of the reform movement, and with that came a level of scrutiny that was harder to ignore with each passing day. Yet, he couldn't afford to get lost in the noise. He couldn't afford to give up. This wasn't about him, it was about the millions of people who had been waiting for change, for justice, for a system that didn't treat them like criminals just because of the color of their skin. The country had been crying out for change for so long, and it wasn't his time to back down. It was his time to push harder. The president, ever the tactician, understood that they had to go on the offensive. She called a special session of Congress, an extraordinary move to push through the next phase of their agenda. The session was meant to counter the opposition, to show the country that the reforms weren't just words, they were actions. James worked around the clock to prepare for the battle ahead. He met with lawmakers, advisors, and activists, refining the strategy and the messaging. They needed to be clear, they needed to be unified, and they needed to show the American people that they weren't backing down. The stakes were too high. The day of the session was tense. James stood in front of the camera, knowing that every word he spoke would be scrutinized. The world was watching. Behind him, the president delivered her speech, outlining the critical reforms they intended to pass, changes that would hold law enforcement accountable, ensure better protections for minority communities, and restore faith in a broken system. As the president finished her speech, James took the stage. His hands were shaking slightly as he spoke, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to be the voice of reason, the one to bridge the divide between the reformers and the opposition. He spoke from the heart, sharing his personal journey, his unwavering belief in the cause, and his commitment to seeing this fight through to the end. The media coverage that followed was a whirlwind. Some outlets praised the president and James for their courage, for taking on the fight that so many others had been too afraid to face. Others were less kind, painting them as naive idealists who were blind to the complexities of policing. But in the midst of the chaos, something began to shift. People were listening. The debate was no longer just about whether the reforms would pass, it was about how they could make the justice system work for everyone. The discourse was changing, and for the first time in years, it felt like there was real potential for lasting transformation. Still, the battle was far from over. The opposition wasn't giving up, and there were still deep divisions within the country about what the future of law enforcement should look like. But James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not just hope that the reforms would succeed, but hope that the movement could inspire something bigger than any piece of legislation. This was about more than laws, it was about changing hearts and minds, about shifting the culture of an entire nation. It was about rebuilding trust in the justice system and ensuring that everyone, no matter their background or their race, had an equal shot at justice. As James sat in his office, looking out at the city skyline, he knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be setbacks, betrayals, and moments of doubt. But he had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. He had seen the toll that systemic injustice had taken on the country, and he knew that the fight for justice had no end. It was a journey, one that would continue long after he was gone. But for the first time in a long time, James felt like they were on the right path. And with every step forward, he knew they were getting closer to the world they had always dreamed of, a world where justice truly meant justice for all. The movement had ignited something in the country. It was no longer just about policy, it was about people. People who had suffered for far too long, people who had been overlooked, oppressed, and forgotten. James knew that the fight wasn't over, but he also knew that the first steps had been taken. The seeds of change had been planted, and all they needed now was time to grow. He took a deep breath, ready for whatever came next, knowing that the fight for justice would never stop, not until every last person had the opportunity to live freely and without fear.